half an acre of junk ground with an old man's vegetable garden on it. I'll take it for nothing. It's worth nothing. Craig Holloway said it to the auction room the way a man says something he has already decided. Loud enough for the room, certain enough that the certainty was the point. The courthouse air was dry and cool, the old building smelling of paper and winter coming. On the back wall, a county map showed Craig's 340 consolidated acres in one continuous block. 3 years of patient acquisition, one parcel at a time. A picture of a strategy nearly complete. The half-acre sat at the map's center, like a gap in a tooth. The room was 12 bidders and 2 county officials and several neighboring landowners who had been watching Craig acquire everything around Otto Flesch for 3 years. They were quiet. Otto was 76 years old. He was sitting in the front row of folding chairs in his canvas jacket, his hands resting on his knees, looking at the auctioneer. He was not looking at Craig. He was not looking at the map. Craig leaned toward him. "Otto, I know you're sentimental about this land. I respect that. But you can't afford to compete with what I'll put on the table today. Let's not drag this out." To Otto's right, a woman named Bev Strand sat with a folder in her lap. She was 54 years old and was Otto's attorney. She had opened the folder 1 inch and closed it again and was waiting for the right moment. But what Craig Holloway had never researched, what his acquisition team had never thought to look for, was that in 1887, when Otto's great-grandmother homesteaded this parcel, she filed a riparian water right with the Territorial Land Office. Priority date: August 14th, 1887. Priority number 7 in Davison County. The oldest and most senior water right in the county. And Craig's 340 acres could not be irrigated without it. Do you know that feeling? When someone tells you what you have is worth nothing, and they've never once looked at what they need? Let's go back 135 years to the August morning Otto's great-grandmother drove a stake in the creek bank and filed a piece of paper at the Territorial Land Office. Erika Flesch was 34 years old in August of 1887. She had come to Davison County with her husband and 3 children in the spring, as thousands of families came to the Dakota Territory that decade, drawn by the land and the possibility of owning it, and the specific freedom that comes from calling something yours. They had filed their homestead claim in April. They had broken sod and built a house and put in a kitchen garden by June. The half-acre at the creek bend was, from the first season, obviously the best ground on the claim. The soil was deep and black, the alluvial deposit the creek had been building for centuries, rich with organic matter and moisture. It was sheltered from the prairie wind by a bend in the waterway. It grew things faster and taller than the surrounding ground, and it had water even in the dry summer weeks when the upland fields were suffering. Erika's husband filed the land claim. Erika filed the water right. She did this not because she fully understood the implications of priority dating. No one in the county entirely did, as water law in the Dakota Territory was still being written. But because she understood that water was the variable in this landscape, and that a claim to water was worth making. She filled out the form at the kitchen table, copied it twice, and drove to Yankton with the children to file it at the Territorial Land Office. The clerk behind the counter was a young man who stamped the document without looking at her. He assigned it priority number 7. He handed her the certified copy. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. That evening, at the creek bank, she drove an iron stake into the soil at the edge of her water access point. She had engraved it herself, using her husband's marking tools before they left for Yankton. E. Flesch, 1887. She drove it in with a fence mallet. 3 blows, and it went in solid. She went back to the house. The creek ran past the stake the same way it had always run. The cottonwoods along the bank dropped their early leaves in the water, and the current took them downstream. Erica watched the creek for a moment, thinking about things she did not have words for yet. Then she went inside to make supper. The document was filed at the county clerk's office and indexed under the original homestead parcel number. Over the following 135 years, the land changed hands within the Flesh family 3 times, was subdivided twice, and eventually reduced to the half-acre that Otto's parents left him in 1978. Each transfer was recorded. Each recording referenced the original parcel number. The water rights stayed attached. None of this was hidden. It was in the county records, correctly filed, indexed under a parcel number that had not been updated since the 1942 subdivision. If you knew to look for it, if you pulled the full title chain for the half-acre, not just the most recent conveyances, you would find it. It was a 30-minute task for any reasonably thorough title searcher. Craig's attorney had pulled title on the adjacent parcels, not on Otto's. Craig had never taken Otto's half-acre seriously enough to order a full search. He had offered $14,000 twice and been refused twice, and had concluded that the auction would settle the matter. He had not thought to look for what the half-acre contained. He would learn, in the courthouse at 10:00 a.m. on September 28th, what it cost to not look. Otto Flesh had come back to the family land in the spring of 1978. He was 32 years old and had been teaching high school in Sioux Falls for 6 years, history and civics, in a school large enough that he had good colleagues and no particular reason to leave. But his parents had died within a year of each other, and the land had come to him, and something in him had decided, without a great deal of deliberation, that he was going to go back. He had grown up on the plot. He knew the creek and the garden and the iron stake at the bank's edge, though he had not known what the stake was until his first summer back, when he was clearing the bank grass and found it, and read the engraving, and went inside and called his aunt in Aberdeen to ask about it. His aunt said, "Oh yes, great-grandma Erica's water stake." She was very serious about the water. He did not investigate further. He knew it was old, and his family's, and connected to the creek in some way that had been important to Erica. He put it back in the shed and gardened. He kept the same half-acre his great-grandmother had gardened. He planted the same kinds of things in different configurations, season by season: tomatoes, beans, squash, sweet corn, beets, carrots, onions, the occasional experiment, melons one year which had done poorly, asparagus one year which had done extremely well and was still producing 4 years later. He sold vegetables at the Mitchell Farmers Market on Saturday mornings from May through October, not because he needed the income, his teacher's pension was adequate, but because the market was a social institution he valued, and because it gave the garden a purpose that kept him disciplined about it. He kept bees. He had started with 2 hives in 1980 and had run as many as 8 at one point. In 2022 he had 4. The bees worked the creekside flowers and the garden, and the honey was particular, dark and floral, and unlike any other honey he had tasted, the specific product of this place. He sold it at the market beside the vegetables. People came back for it. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a man who thought about wealth in the terms Craig Holloway thought about it. He thought about the season and the soil and the creek level in August, when the water ran low, and the bees and the asparagus bed that was still going strong in its 43rd year. These were the things that required attention. and he gave them attention. Craig's first offer in 2021 had been delivered through an intermediary, a county real estate agent who called Otto at home and described a buyer interested in land consolidation. The offer was $10,000. Otto said no. Craig's second offer in the spring of 2022 was $14,000, delivered by Craig in person at the garden gate. Craig had driven out on a Thursday morning in June and parked at the road and walked down to the gate and stood on the outside of it. Otto was in the garden, tying up the tomato cages. Craig made his case with the deliberate patience of a man who expected that patience would eventually produce the result he wanted. Otto thanked him for stopping by. Craig drove away. Otto went back to the tomatoes. Bev Strand's law office was in Mitchell, 2 blocks from the courthouse. She handled farm and land matters, some estate work, the occasional business dispute. She had known Otto for 12 years. He had come to her originally about his parents' estate and had stayed, in the way of clients with whom a good working relationship develops, for matters that came up over the years. On an evening in March 2022, she was pulling the full title chain on a parcel adjacent to Otto's for a different client, a landowner who was reviewing boundary history in preparation for a property line dispute. The chain took her back through several decades of conveyances and eventually to a reference to the original homestead parcel number. She followed the reference and found the water right registry in the county clerk's digitized historical records. She almost moved past it. Title searches turn up old attachments regularly, and most of them are superseded or irrelevant. But something in the priority date caught her attention. August 14th, 1887, priority number 7 in Davison County. She sat with it for a moment. She called the water rights section of the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources the following morning and asked a question. What was the current standing of a riparian water right filed as priority number 7 in Davison County in 1887? The answer came back in 2 days. Priority number 7 was still valid, still senior, and had never been superseded. In South Dakota's prior appropriation system, a right with that priority date outranked every other water claim in the county. It was not subject to reallocation without the holder's consent. She called Otto. He answered on the 3rd ring. She explained what she had found. She read him the priority date. She explained, in the simplest language she could, what a priority number 7 riparian right meant in the context of the James River Valley and the creek that ran along the edge of his garden. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does this mean for Craig Holloway's land?" She said, "It means his 340 acres cannot be irrigated without your permission." He was quiet again. She said, "Otto, his entire development is based on creek irrigation. His concept plan shows the creek as the primary water source." Otto said, "I see." She said, "I need you to tell me what you want to do with this." He thought about it for a moment. He said, "I want to keep the land, and I want Craig to know, in front of people, what the land is." She said, "All right. The auction is September 28th. We have time." In the months between Bev's discovery and the auction, Craig continued acquiring. He completed the last of his adjacent parcels in August, bringing his consolidated total to 340 acres surrounding Otto's half-acre on 3 sides, the creek on the 4th. He was, by that point, deeply committed. He had financed the acquisition at significant leverage. The development plan was before the county planning office. The half-acre was the only piece missing. He submitted the consolidation concept plan to the county in August. The plan showed the half-acre labeled pending acquisition. It was a public document. Bev found it online within 3 days. She pulled Craig's concept plan and read the irrigation section. The creek was the development's primary water source. The plan assumed unrestricted riparian access. She called a water rights attorney in Pierre and described the situation. He gave her an assessment. Without a license from the priority number 7 holder, Craig's development could not legally irrigate from the creek. The license value, in a commercial agricultural development context, was potentially $300,000 or more over a 10-year term. She did not contact Craig's team. She filed the water right priority certificate with the county clerk's office for formal re-indexing under the current parcel identifier, a routine procedural step that made the document findable under Otto's current parcel number rather than the 1887 homestead number. The clerk processed it in a day. On September 15th, Craig's attorney sent Otto a letter. It offered $18,000, a final opportunity before the auction. The letter's closing line said, "We believe competitive bidding at auction will not serve your interests as well as this private settlement." Bev read the letter and called it what it was. "They still don't know," she said. "What do you mean?" Otto said. "They're still offering $18,000, she said. "If they knew about the water right, they would not be offering $18,000. They would be calling me to negotiate." Otto was quiet. She said, "They've never looked." Craig's attorney pulled title on the surrounding parcels when he was acquiring them. He never thought to pull the full chain on your plot, because Craig never thought you were worth a full search. Otto said, "What happens at the auction?" "You bid," she said. "I read the water right into the record before the bidding opens. After that, the room will understand what the half-acre is worth. Craig won't bid." "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "If he bids, he's bidding against himself. He needs the water right more than the parcel. He'll need to negotiate with you regardless." Otto said, "All right, let's go to the auction." The courthouse auction room filled slowly on the morning of September 28th. 12 bidders, the 2 county officials, a handful of neighboring landowners who had received the notice and were curious about the consolidation's completion. Craig arrived at 9:40 with his attorney and took a position at the bidding table. He was confident in the easy way of men who have done the calculation and liked the result. Otto arrived at 9:55 with Bev. He sat in the front row. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at the auctioneer. At 10 o'clock, the auctioneer called the room to attention and began reading the parcel description. Craig made his statement. Bev waited until the auctioneer finished and looked toward the room for opening bids. She stood. "Before bidding opens," she said, "I need to enter into the record a water rights priority certificate filed with the county clerk, original date August 14, 1887, priority number 7 in Davison County." She placed the certificate on the auctioneer's table. She placed the county soil survey beside it. She read the access description aloud, the specific language of the 1887 filing, the creek access point, the appurtenant nature of the right, its attachment to the half-acre parcel, its seniority over all other water rights in the county. She read it in a clear, level voice. The room was very quiet. Craig picked up the certificate. He read the priority date. He read the access note. He looked at the map on the back wall, the 340 acres, the creek on the 4th side, the half-acre in the middle. He looked at the irrigation source indicated in his own concept plan, which was taped to the map as a reference. He looked at his attorney. His attorney was writing on a notepad very fast. Craig set the certificate back on the table. He did not pick it up again. The neighboring landowner near the back leaned to the person beside him. "That half-acre controls the creek," he said, very quietly. But the room was very quiet. "Bidding is open," the auctioneer said. There was a pause. Otto said, 14,000. No one else said anything. Craig did not move. The gavel came down. The parcel was sold to Otto Flesch for $14,000, the exact amount Craig had offered him 18 months earlier. The amount Craig had used as leverage, as the fair market ceiling. The number that was supposed to tell Otto what his land was worth and, implicitly, what he wasn't. The room filed out. Craig and his attorney stayed at the bidding table for a while, talking in low voices. Otto and Bev walked out into the September air. "What happens now?" Otto said. "They call me," Bev said. They called her within the week. Craig's attorney, professional and careful, proposed a meeting to discuss water right licensing terms. Bev had already prepared a draft. The water rights attorney from Pierre had prepared the underlying assessment, $310,000 over a 10-year term, based on the development's irrigation requirements and the market rate for licensed senior water rights in South Dakota. Craig's team negotiated. Bev negotiated. They reached an agreement in 6 weeks. The license fee was $310,000, payable in structured installments over 10 years. The access provisions were specific and enforceable. Otto signed. The first installment arrived at Otto's bank in December. He used part of it to buy a new greenhouse, 8 by 20 feet, poly-covered. Enough to extend his growing season by 6 weeks on each end. He bought 2 new beehives and a package of Italian bees to populate them. He did not tell anyone about the money in the way that some people would tell it. He mentioned it to Bev over coffee, and to Earl Cruz, the neighboring landowner, who had caught his eye at the January meeting, and to his son in Sioux Falls, who called once a month. He did not announce it at the farmer's market or post about it anywhere. He gardened. On a Saturday morning in October, after the auction and before the first hard frost, Otto drove the iron stake from the shed to the creek bank. It had been in the shed for most of 40 years. He had moved it there from wherever it had sat before, not thinking much about it. He stood at the creek bank for a moment. The cottonwoods were yellow. The water was low in October, running clear over the gravel at the bend, the same water that had been running past this bank since before the family arrived, since before the territory was a state, since before the United States had a claim to this particular ground. He chose the spot by the markings in the soil, the old hole where the original had stood, faintly visible in the bank, a slight depression that a century of seasons had not entirely filled. 3 blows with the fence mallet. The stake went in solid. Flesch 1887. Iron, hand engraved, 135 years old, still legible in the light. He stood there for a while. The creek ran past. The cottonwood leaves came down one by one in the still air. He went back to the garden. There is something in Otto Flesch's story that deserves saying plainly. He did not know about the water right. Not fully. He had known the stake was his great-grandmother's, had known it was connected to the creek, had not known what that connection was worth. The knowledge lived in the county records, correctly filed, waiting for someone to pull the right title chain. Bev Strand pulled the title chain. That was her job. That was what she was good at. But she pulled it because she was paying attention. Because Otto had mentioned Craig's purchase pattern, and something about the pattern had told her to look. Attention. The willingness to follow a thread when something about it feels worth following. This is not glamorous work. It is the work of a person who sits in a records room on an evening and pulls a chain of title documents and does not stop at the point where most people would stop. It is the work of a woman who, when she finds a document stamped Priority 7, August 14th, 1887, does not move past it, who sits with it for a moment and asks what it means. Craig Holloway was not a stupid man. He was a capable developer who had assembled 340 acres of South Dakota land through 3 years of patient acquisition. His mistake was specific and entirely recoverable in a different world. He had not thought that Otto was worth a full title search. He had let his dismissal of the half-acre as junk ground extend to a dismissal of the legal history of that ground. The ground's value in his estimation was so low that it did not warrant the 30-minute research task that would have changed his entire strategy. That assumption cost him $310,000, which is, in the end, a precise number for what it costs to look at something and decide, without looking closely, that it isn't worth your time. You know this feeling from the other direction. You know what it is to have something dismissed by someone who has not looked. You know the patience of waiting for the right person to look. Or in some cases, you know the relief of having an attorney who thinks to pull the title chain. The half-acre is still Otto's. The creek still runs past the stake. The asparagus is in its 45th year and still producing. The bees are working the creekside flowers. The water right is on file under the current parcel identifier, correctly indexed, findable now by anyone who looks. Everyone who looks. If this story found something in you, the particular satisfaction of a 135-year-old document doing exactly what it was filed to do, subscribe and hit the bell. We tell these stories every week. We have the story of a market gardener in North Dakota whose hop contract had a clause nobody thought she'd read. We have the story of a shepherd in Virginia who bred for wool fineness for 34 years. We have an orange Alice Chalmers in the Texas Hill Country that a dealer offered $800 for, and the morning a judge called its value $38,000. A country full of half-acres. A country full of stakes in the ground that have been there longer than anyone remembered to look. Tell us in the comments, what did you hold on to that someone else decided wasn't worth keeping? We want to know. We'll see you next week. The garden in 40 seasons. Otto had learned early that a half-acre was plenty. He had heard from farmers who ran hundreds of acres, and he was surrounded by them. That scale was the measure of seriousness. That a man who farmed half an acre was a hobbyist, not a farmer. He had not argued with this. He had gardened. In 44 seasons, he had learned things about this half-acre that you could not learn about a large operation. Because a large operation doesn't give you the time to know it that well. He knew which corner dried out first in August. He knew the row where the tomatoes always did best, the second from the east, where the morning light hit first, and the afternoon shadow from the cottonwoods kept the soil from baking. He knew the patch near the creek bank, where the soil temperature ran 2 degrees warmer in spring, which was where he set his transplants out a week ahead of the rest of the garden. He kept a garden notebook, the way serious gardeners do. Not a daily journal, but a record. What he planted, when he planted it, what the season did, what came out of the ground. The notebooks went back to 1984, the year he decided to be systematic about it. 38 years of half-acre seasons in a box on the shed shelf. He had read his great-grandmother Erica's journal, which his aunt in Aberdeen had kept. It was not a farming journal, but a personal one. Her life in the territory, the children, the neighbors, the weather. But it had entries about the garden, the creek, the stake she drove in the bank. He had read those entries several times. He had felt, reading them, that he was doing the same work she had done on the same ground. Which was not surprising, given that it was the same ground and the same kind of work. But feeling it was different from knowing it intellectually. Feeling it meant something. The asparagus bed was the thing that most directly connected him to Erica. He had not planted it. It had been there when he arrived in 1978, already established, already several decades old. His aunt thought Erica had planted it, which would have put the crowns in the ground sometime before 1910. Asparagus lives a very long time. The bed was still producing in the garden's 4th decade under Otto's management. He harvested it every spring and sold it at the market and thought about Erica. Bev at the county records office, Bev had been pulling title chains for 30 years. She was very good at it. She was good at it in the way that people who do a technical thing carefully for a long time become good at it. Not brilliantly, not inspirationally, but thoroughly and accurately. With the specific knowledge of where to look that is not written down anywhere, but lives in the hands of the person who has done it many times. She had been to the county clerk's office so often that she knew the staff by name, and they knew her. She knew where the water right registries were in the digital system and in the older paper records and in the microfilm cabinet that still held the pre-1960 documents. She knew that the historical water right records were indexed by original parcel number, not by current owner, which was a detail that caught many searchers off guard. On the evening she found the flesh water right, she had been in the records office for 3 hours on the other matter. She was tired. She would not have followed the parcel number reference if she had been less careful, or if the number had not shown up in a part of the chain where she was not expecting to find an attachment. She followed it because that was how she worked. You follow every thread, because the one you don't follow is usually fine and occasionally is not. She found the water right at 6:15 in the evening. She read it once. Carefully, she read it again. She sat for about 2 minutes without doing anything. Then, she called Otto's number. He didn't answer. He was outside, she learnt later, checking on the bees in the last of the evening light. She left a message. Otto, it's Bev. I've found something you need to know about. Call me in the morning. She drove home. She made dinner. She sat at her desk for an hour after dinner and wrote out the legal analysis by hand on a yellow pad, what the document was, what the priority date meant, what the implications were for the surrounding parcels. By the time she went to bed, the analysis was complete. She was not angry on Otto's behalf. Exactly. She did not have a personal stake in Craig Holloway's humiliation. She was a lawyer, and this was a legal matter, and the law was clear. But she was something. She was the thing that a person who does careful work for a long time feels when the careful work turns out to matter. Not pride exactly, which would be too large a word for it, but the quiet satisfaction of having followed the thread. Earl Cruz had farmed his own ground in Davison County for 40 years, north of Otto's plot, separated by a quarter section that one of Craig's acquisitions had crossed. He was 69 years old and had watched Craig buy the surrounding land with the attention of a neighbor who understands that what happens next to your property affects your own situation. He had not been able to do anything about it. The land Craig bought was not his. The sellers had their reasons. He had no claim on anyone's decision. But he had watched. He was at the county landowners meeting in January when Craig had described legacy parcel inefficiency, and he had understood which parcel Craig meant, and he had found Otto's eye across the room and given him the look of a man who is watching something unfair and cannot stop it from the outside. He was at the auction on September 28th. He had come because he wanted to see what happened. He was not surprised by the priority certificate. He had not known about it specifically. But he had the farmer's sense that something was not right about Craig's certainty. That there was a piece missing from the picture Craig was presenting of himself as the inevitable outcome of the morning. When Bev read the certificate aloud and he heard the date, August 14th, 1887, he understood before Craig did. He had enough farming history to know what a water right that old meant in this county. He leaned to his neighbor and said very quietly that Half-Acre controls the creek. Then he sat back and watched Craig read the document. He did not see triumph in Otto's face. He had not expected to. Otto was looking at the auctioneer as he had been from the beginning. He bid $14,000 and the gavel came down, and that was that. Earl came to the garden the following Saturday with a flat of strawberry crowns he had been planning to give Otto for spring planting. He had planned to bring them regardless of the auction's outcome. He was glad the outcome had been what it was. But the strawberries were not a victory gift. They were just what a neighbor brings. Otto put the kettle on, and they sat at the garden shed table and talked for an hour. About the season, about the asparagus, about the bees, about the creek level that fall. Not about Craig. About the things that were actually true about the Half-Acre, which had nothing to do with Craig at all. Otto's son. Otto's son David lived in Sioux Falls and taught middle school science. He called once a month, as he had since his mother died in 2014. The calls followed a reliable pattern. David would ask about the garden and the bees and the market, and Otto would report on all three, and they would talk about David's students for a while, and then the call would wind down. They were not a family that had ever talked for very long on the phone. They were better in person, at the garden, working side by side the way they had worked when David was growing up. Otto called David after the auction. Not to tell the story dramatically. He did not tell stories dramatically, but to let him know the outcome. He said, "The land auction was this week. I kept the plot." David said, "I knew you would." Otto said, "Bev found a water right. It turned out to be important." David said, "A water right?" "Your great-great-grandmother filed it in 1887. It was in the county records. Bev found it when she was doing the title work." David was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "It means Craig Holloway's development needs my permission to use the creek for irrigation. Bev negotiated a license. He's going to pay for the water." Another pause. Then David said, "What's the license worth? Over 10 years? $310,000. The silence was longer this time. David said, "You're not kidding. Bev is very good at her job," Otto said. David said, "Dad, do you understand how significant that is?" "I bought a greenhouse," Otto said, "and 2 new hives." David laughed. He laughed the way you laugh when something has happened that is bigger than the words you have for it, and the person you are talking to has named the most concrete, specific consequence they can identify, which is a greenhouse, and the laugh is the only response equal to the gap. Otto waited for the laugh to settle. Then he said, "You should come down in the spring. The asparagus will be going. I'll be there," David said. He was. The asparagus bed in spring-April the following year. The asparagus was pushing up through the dark soil in the way it always did, the spears coming first as small, tight buttons barely visible at the surface, then lengthening over the course of 3 or 4 warm days into the firm, tapered shoots that were the best of the year's eating. David was there. He had driven down on a Thursday evening and was staying the weekend. On Friday morning he was at the garden with Otto, and they were doing what the Flesh family had done on this ground for 135 years, bending over the asparagus bed in the spring morning, harvesting what was ready, leaving what needed another day. David had studied biology before he went into teaching, and he was interested in the asparagus from that angle, the genetics of a crown that had been in this soil for at least a century, possibly longer. He asked his father how old the bed really was. Otto said he thought it was Erika's. He told David about the journal. David straightened up and looked at the bed with a different expression, the look of a man revising his understanding of something. "So we're harvesting asparagus that Erika planted," he said. "Something like that," Otto said. David looked at the creek. The iron stake was visible at the bank. Flesh 1887, recently redriven, the engraving dark with the soil that had worked into the letters over the winter. "She picked a good spot," David said. "She did," Otto said. They finished the harvest and went inside and made breakfast. The morning was cool and clear, the way April mornings in the James River Valley can be, the sky a particular thin blue, the lights still low and angled, the cottonwoods not yet in full leaf, everything waiting for the warmth that was coming. Otto poured coffee. He looked at his son across the kitchen table. David was looking at the window, at the garden visible through it. "You're going to keep it," David said. "Not a question." "Yes," Otto said. "Good," David said. They sat with that for a while. The coffee was hot. The morning was quiet. Through the window, the asparagus bed and the garden and the creek and the stake in the bank, the whole of the half-acre, which was not much land by any conventional measure, and was exactly what it had always been. Craig Holloway's development did not stop. He was a practical man, and when the situation had been clarified at the auction and then again by the water rights attorney in Pierre, he had moved to negotiate rather than resist. He was not a man who wasted time on outcomes that couldn't be changed. He had made errors. He had assumed Otto was not worth careful research. He had not thought about the history of the land he was surrounding. He had imagined the development from the outside, the 340 acres, the concept plan, the irrigated production system, without looking closely at the piece in the middle. These were recoverable errors. $310,000 over 10 years was a significant cost, but it was not fatal to the project, which was planned at a scale where that kind of carrying cost was manageable. He had done the math, and it still worked. Narrower than he had planned, but within the range of viable. He did not visit Otto again. The negotiation was conducted through attorneys and had been handled professionally. But he had learned something. A parcel of land is not what it looks like from the road. It is what it contains in the county records, in the filings made by the people who came before. He told his attorney, "Pull everything. Next time, pull everything." His attorney said, "We will. We have been telling you stories about farmers and old machines and land that turned out to matter more than anyone expected. We have told you about a widow's wheat in Montana and an old tractor in a flooded Kansas field, and a shepherd who bred fine wool for 34 years. We have told you about a woman who read her own contract and an orange Alice Chalmers that appraised for 40 times the dealer's offer. And now we have told you about Otto Flesch and the half-acre his great-grandmother homesteaded in 1887 and the water rights she filed at the Territorial Land Office in Yankton, a specific act on a specific day that still mattered 135 years later. The document filed correctly, the record kept faithfully, the stake driven in solid. These things don't announce themselves. They sit in the county clerk's office, waiting for the attorney who thinks to pull the full chain. The ground knows. The records know. The question is always the same. Did anyone look? Subscribe. Because we look. Every week. Tell us in the comments about the land, or the document, or the piece of old iron that turned out to matter, that someone else dismissed, that time or a closer look revealed to be exactly what it was. We read every one. We'll see you next week.